With me today is Dr. Holger Zellentin, and he's going to address the question, why study religion?
Why study religion? The question really is there anything such as religion with a big R out there that is broader than any specific?
So you're making a distinction between religion and religions.
Indeed, indeed. We all know there are specific religions. Basically everybody can say, what does a Christian look like? What does a Jew look like? A Muslim, a Buddhist, something beyond those traditional paradigms even. But the question really is there something which we could find in any culture that we can call religion? And that is a question that has been asked many years ago, since the Enlightenment and before. And many answers have been tried. People mostly in the Western world have tried to relate religion to a sense of the supernatural. But we have learned increasingly that this is a very Western concept. We can't relate it to our beliefs in God, even at an abstract level. So the more recent, and I find very exciting attempts, are moving to describe religion in terms of narratives. And not any old narrative, but narratives to live by. That is, I think, a very interesting concept. And we think of narratives, I mean, the Lord of the Rings is a wonderful narrative. And I would say, well, is it meant to be lived by? Well, some people obviously do live by it. They dress up and they explore the world of Middle-earth and greater interest in our world. But it doesn't have that reach of a broad, all-encompassing narrative that we do get, I would say, in any religion that is known, that has been studied. Now, a narrative to live by would not necessarily take on the form of a religion outwardly. If you look at secularism, and that really is the biggest question, the biggest debate in the modern study of religion, is secularism itself a religion? How can we, if we say that religion is all-encompassing, can there be anything outside of it? And if so, secularism as a reaction to religion, is that something which then would mess up our idea? And it has messed up many ideas, because people aren't supposed to be secular if everybody is religious. But then again, if you think in terms of this big, grand narrative, two things come to surface. One is that any narrative of secularism is itself a narrative. It comes out of an Enlightenment tradition. It comes out of a reaction to religion. And even more importantly, the means by which a secularist will verify his or her own beliefs, her own versions of reality, can almost always be traced directly to a religious narrative lying underneath. So even a secular narrative, even a communist narrative, will very often use metaphors, will use means, goals, ends, and most of all means of verification that can directly be traced to the religion underneath.
Can you give me an example of how a grand narrative like secularism relies on religious motifs? Because at one level, the secular narrative is the rejection of religion.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps the most clear example would be, imagine a physicist who has absolutely no sense of anything supernatural, and he will say, well, we still must face the truth that the universe is falling apart, that we get reduced to nothingness, and that everything crumbles, which sounds like a pretty secular statement, but even in there you have the truth and the acceptance. And you have the quest for something which does refer, even within the secular system, to a claim that cannot be verified within the system. Because what is truth? Truth is something that needs to be verified. And again, here you feed into an Enlightenment narrative. This is, of course, an extreme example where you would certainly say, well, the religious remnant is rather small, but it still is there. And we can't understand even the term of truth without the tradition that lies behind it.
Why is narrative so important?
Why is narrative so important? Here I think we can step up a little and engage the language of religious symbolism, which is the concept that underlies the whole shift in religious studies to the study of these all-encompassing narratives. Religion, according to the famous anthropologist Clifford Geertz, is a system of symbols that is so that seems so uniquely true, and is cloaked in such a impression of reality that people will take these symbols as ultimate reality. And this brings us back to the question you're asking. The symbols themselves, such as truth in the narrative of our secular physicist, is a religious symbol that cannot be reduced to any clear, significant reality that you could check, that you could reduce to physics, because truth isn't a claim that can be made in clear terms. And if you look at it as a religious symbol, then I would say you can relate that symbol of truth to the symbol of Christ, of the cross in Christianity, to other symbols that are equally powerful and that will compel people. And you can go on and look for these symbols in other narratives and focus really on them. If you go to, say, a communist narrative, you'll have the liberation of the masses. If you go to a feminist narrative, you also have the liberation, say, of women. These symbols you'll find in any of those narratives, and that actually gives us the main advantage of speaking of religion in these very broad terms. There's a price to pay, namely that you have to really look at the smallest common denominator between cultures, which is very difficult and will always get you in trouble. But then you can say, okay, well, people do act based on these narratives, and they do act based on these symbols, such as truth, such as the cross, such as the Torah, or what have you. And then I think you can start to gain an understanding of cultures, which will be a deeper one, which will be a better one, and which will also allow you to engage different cultures, to engage more precisely cultural difference within our society or internationally, wherever you may go.
If these narratives, if people are living by different narratives and these narratives are shared by groups, what is the possibility of the narratives being able to communicate with one another?
It really depends on the narratives. I would say there is both danger and opportunity in the proximity of narratives. If people share a common narrative, the most well-known example, I don't know if it's the most important, of course, is that of Christianity and Judaism. If people share the symbolism and the narrative of ancient Israel, of Moses, well, we've seen that throughout the Middle Ages, this has led to a lot of violence. At the same time, Jews and Christians could share certain images and speak each other's language very easily. So they always have the chance to mess it up, and they have the chance to understand.
Can you make a distinction between narratives that are actually closing narratives that close down the possibility of dialogue, and narratives that would place value on dialogue? I'll give you an example. You can remember, if you're remembering the great Jewish narrative of Moses, you can remember that he meets Jethro, who is a priest of Midian, and that means that, in other words, there is openness to other narratives. But you could also read the narrative of another part of the Moses narrative, which would be Moses on Sinai, coming down and seeing the golden calf, and there is no possibility of dialogue. In a sense, is there a responsibility on people who live within narratives to realize that their narratives may not be, number one, their narratives don't embrace everyone, and therefore they have to emphasize in their narratives the openness to there are other narratives?
No, that's a very good question, and I think when one looks at religions, there's always much to choose from, and tradition itself has chosen parts of it, parts have been neglected. And I think that the example of the golden calf is really a very good one, because you can read it as a symbol really of religious intolerance, of dogmatism. Anybody who deviates from this will be annihilated. I mean, this is really what it's about. But at the same time, you can say, well, look, who is sharing this narrative against idolatry? The golden calf is very prominent, of course, in the Jewish tradition. It's very prominent in the Christian tradition. It is very prominent in the Quran. it is a common narrative that seeks to fight materialism. I mean, the golden calf was really made of gold, and it's a very specific way of relating the Godhead with matter and with the immediate human needs for wealth and things like that. So if you look at it from that perspective, the narrative actually will allow you to engage other religions very openly, because you can say, well, this is shared. Of course, within that narrative, there's always danger and opportunity. And the study of religion itself gives you the tools to implement a certain social agenda, but it doesn't tell you where to go.
So, in a sense, you're saying that since human beings always always live within narrative, you're actually coming back to an older position that human beings are incurably religious, because they are, not because they need to have shrines or light candles or engage in ritual practices, but because they actually need narratives, that the study of religion is actually a contribution to understanding the human person.
Absolutely. And that, yes, the human being is absolutely religious and cannot really leave that behind if you define it this very way, namely that any human being will have imbibed in her youth, in her childhood, a certain narrative that she cannot leave, but she can realize it. And the study of religion helps to bring people at the forefront how they relate to their own tradition, which I think is a very helpful aspect of society and of societal change.
I'm reminded of the old story of the Greek sea battle, when they sent the message to the oracle, "Will the gods be with us if we call upon them in the sea battle? Whether you call or whether you don't call, the gods will be present."
Yes, there's something to that. And I would say the interesting thing about this narrative is also that it does, I think, feed in quite well with modern insights about neurology, about our own inherent sense of religiosity, of genetic predispositions. And what's also important to realize is that the study of religion as such does not pass any judgment. It does not say whether religion is good or bad, or whether even we seek to aspire to something else. It is not secular in itself, because it does accept the very religiosity of human beings. And I think here is a chance also for a renewed dialogue between people who do subscribe to specific traditions, Christians, Muslims, and to people who see themselves as purely secular. And I think studying religion in that way will show these people that they do share a common human basis, and will, I think, thereby create better ways to handle societal tension about religious matters wherever they arise.
On that very optimistic note, Holger, thank you.